In 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, sparking global condemnation and leading to tens of thousands of people being killed and wounded in the past 3 years. This is what we in the West and Western media have focused on in that time, but the current war really started in 2014, when Russia occupied and annexed Crimea. And for Ukrainians in the region, this was just the latest in more than a century of war, occupation, and resistance. My name is Eric Bowman. I'm the communications specialist at the Canadian Psychological Association, and this is the CPA podcast, Mindful. Resilience is a word we hear often in the context of ongoing conflicts, wars, and atrocities. What makes a person resilient? What makes a population resilient? And what does resilience actually mean when there are so many wildly different contexts for how and when people come out the other side of something so terrible? My guest today is deeply interested in this phenomenon, an interest that stems in large part from his family's Ukrainian background.
So I'm Tomas Vanderkam. I'm a researcher at both the University of British Columbia and Simon Fraser. One of the things that I study right now is psychological resilience and moral decision-making in what we call high-stakes contexts. And so what do I mean high-stakes contexts? One example would be war. And a good place to start with my own personal background would be I was raised on stories of war, and I don't mean that in any intense kind of way. I mean that sort of matter-of-factly. So my family are from Western Ukraine, Galicia, which is an area particularly affected by war before, during, and between World War I, World War II. And the experience of my family was the front, I say the front, but really it was several military fronts, moved back and forth over our village many, many times, to the point where the joke in the family was, who is it this week, right? Which occupation is it this week?
Right.
And so there was the front between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire. There was the West Ukraine People's Republic versus the Polish and later Bolshevik forces. There was the German Wehrmacht and the Polish army, and then later the Soviet Red Army versus the Polish army. And so it was to the point where we basically had Yelp reviews of the different occupations, right? The Poles weren't too bad. The German soldiers were mean and nasty and competent. The Soviets were mean and nasty and incompetent. And the Austrians were, it's a funny way to say it, but my family's favorite occupation was the Austrians. They said they pretty much left everybody alone as long as they paid their taxes. And so war was normal in my family background. It wasn't pleasant, but it was normal. And so part of my family, where I come from, escaped to Canada around 1939, and another leg stayed back to become quite prominent Ukrainian liberators in the 1960s, dissident writers, archivists, historians, and so on. And so the research that I do often gets labeled with this tagline of extreme environments. And I have a bone to pick with that, because in psychology, we tend to treat extreme experiences like war and displacement and state violence as rare or abnormal, as if the human condition is basically stable, but with a few chaotic exceptions. And my thing is, for a stunning percentage of people on Earth, these so-called extremes are actually the everyday. And so that's the disconnect that motivates the psychology that I do. I think we do a real disservice to populations who live with conflict and repression when we build an entire science around calm, safe, Western lab settings. So that's the gap I'm hoping to fill with my work.
Now, and that's something that I really wanted to talk to you about, right, is this Western idea that we have, right? We see what's happening in Ukraine right now. We're all globally horrified by it. But you, as, somebody whose family is a Ukrainian diaspora, who have lived in this circumstance for years and years, and the rest of us may not realize just how long this has been going on and how it really was and has been for a century, the status quo in that area. I'm wondering how you look at these things and how your family talks about these things that are currently happening through that lens, and living in a place where maybe the people around you don't understand that same reality.
Yeah, so I grew up in Canada, where we do politeness. We are a very polite society.
We're aggressively polite.
Aggressively polite is a great way to put it, right? And so, to the point where I think we actually discriminate against conversations that are at all uncomfortable. So I grew up with, like I say, stories of war being this sort of matter-of-fact thing. And I think that informed a way of looking at the world. Like, I was raised on, it can happen again. And so I remember being a little kid growing up thinking, not in a paranoid way, when is it going to happen again? But just this background awareness of like, it's the war is not something from history books. Like, war is something that is always going to be there in some way or another. And so I got pretty interested in looking at psychological resilience in, again, what we sometimes call extreme environments. I like the term high stakes contexts, because it's just not covered enough. When we do, a great example in psychology might be something like the 5-factor model of personality. And for any listeners not familiar with that, 5-factor model of personality is, I would say, the most prominent model of personality that we have right now. We've tried to get it down to 4. Some people have tried to add a 6th, but basically this 5-factor model has been the most robust. And on these 5 factors of personality, one of them is conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is all about how good do you keep promises to yourself and to others. And conscientiousness is just a great personality trait to have. Like, it's associated with all the positive outcomes, health outcomes, psychological outcomes, all of that. And so if you're good at keeping promises to yourself and to others, well, that's fine if the promise is get that email to Bill on Tuesday, or go to the gym even when I don't feel like it, right? That's great for all of your outcomes.
Right.
But what if the promise is kill those 10 or 20 or 50 people? And by the way, if you don't, they're going to kill you and most, if not, of all of the people you care about. What if the promise is protect my family at any cost? That's the kind of shift I am interested in, right? When the moral and situational landscape changes so dramatically that we're forced to confront the limit case for ordinary psychology, right? What happens beyond the point where our existing frameworks break down? Because we know they do. There's a point past which modern, everyday, Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic psychology doesn't apply anymore. And so what happens beyond that? Well, for decades, we assumed that people who endure war, for instance, they would be traumatized, they would be dysfunctional, they'd be defined by psychological damage. But the data tell us that only about 20 to 30% of people, even after really extreme traumas, will develop PTSD. And on the other side of that, we now know that roughly that same proportion, 20 or 30%, show post-traumatic growth, again, even after the most extreme traumas. And so we're not just talking about surviving and being okay. We're talking about almost a third of people who transform in a positive way, even after very extreme traumatic experiences.
Right. And I want to get into your work here in a second, but first, you just used the word moral injury a minute ago, and I wanted to sort of flesh out what that really means. The difference between, a moral injury and a catastrophic traumatic experience.
Yeah, I mean, moral injury is something to the effect of, in this context, it might be, having to kill 10 or 20 or 50 people in order to protect your family. And when you get into these high stakes moral quandaries, again, the regular psychological categories that we have break down. Like I say, for personality, conscientiousness is a nice example from the regular 5-factor model. There's also, out of UBC, there's the dark triad and now the dark tetrad. That was Del Paulus. And when we talk about in an everyday context something like psychopathy or even sadism, it's like those don't tend to be adaptive personality traits, at the office or with your family and your relationships. But in a high stakes moral environment, even something like a dark personality trait, something like sadism, something like psychopathy, can be adaptive. And again, that's one of these everyday psychological categories that I find insufficient when you push the everyday experiences of people into these, again, we call them extremes, but like war and state oppression, like that's actually the norm for a huge chunk of people. So that's
Right.
what I'm interested in.
And I'm thinking that personality trait like a sadism or like a psychopathy or something would function in a sense to inoculate somebody from moral injury. Am I thinking correctly there? Because I'm thinking if I was in that situation and I had to kill someone to save my family or whatever, morally, I would still feel quite broken up about that. I don't know if I'd be okay, but if I had one of those personality traits, it's more likely that I'd be inoculated to the ramifications down the line of having had to do so, right?
Yeah, so you're exactly right about that. Dark personality traits can be one of these adaptive mechanisms. Surgeons are a great example. Surgeons need to have, they don't need to, but surgeons do well to have a little bit higher psychopathy than the average person, because if you need to go in and cut somebody open, and especially if you need to save their life, you can't really be wincing, right, every time there's a little bit of blood, or every time somebody's screaming in pain, especially if you're an emergency surgeon, right? Those aren't dark personality traits aren't the only adaptive factor. Switching the moral framework into one of survival will allow even people who would maybe experience moral injury, that shift into the life or death can really allow pretty extreme things to be rationalized, isn't the right word, but to be justified, right? To be understood as actually part of maybe not morally right, but at least the moral norm.
Right, like necessity sort of trumps anything that would otherwise be a factor in that circumstance.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you mentioned that your family are some of them are archivists in Ukraine and have been since the 60s. And I'm sure that you've, do you go to your family to look back into some of these things in order to do the work that you're doing? You came to my attention because of a presentation you did at the CPA convention in St. John's this past summer. And you definitely used a lot of archival data, a lot of, Ukrainian history in that presentation. Do you turn to your family for that? Is it that easy? I go to my dad for agricultural statistics if I want to know about, people's relationships to farms and that sort of thing.
Nice. Yeah, I do. And it is in some ways that easy to get access to archival data. These are public data, so I don't actually need to go through my family. The way I happened upon the data sets that I used for the work that I did that got me to CPA and that put me on your radar, my uncles, two of my uncles, the dissidents, were actually part of the sample of my very first undergraduate thesis. So there was a archival enterprise museum in Kyiv. No, sorry, this was in Kharkiv. That it was called the Kharkiv Human Rights Protection Group, and they have seriously long-form archives of interviews with a variety of dissidents and survivors of, mostly survivors of the Gulag system, because being put in Gulag was the common punishment for, well, you could call it doing dissident activity, but, these individuals, 95 narratives are what constituted the sample for that first undergrad thesis of mine, which is what I presented at CPA. These were individuals who did anything from, actual armed insurgency against the Soviets that, fair enough, they're going to put you in Gulag for that if they can catch you, all the way down to just owning a piece of Ukrainian literature or, teaching a Ukrainian poem to your kid. Like that was seen as anti-state activity. My uncles, they didn't do armed dissidents. They ran drills, they had weapons, they were ready. Most of that was stolen from these different occupations, right? When the front would retreat, they'd leave a bunch of stuff behind, and my uncles would go, "Oh, cool, some German weapons." So it's not that they weren't ready to do that, but most of what they did was almost prank-like. It was little subversions to make the Soviet authorities look, or more accurately, to expose the Soviet authorities for not being competent, let's say. And so you could end up in Gulag for, I wouldn't call them, harmless pranks, because they were dissident pranks to, like I say, maybe not influence public opinion, but to make people aware that, to plant that seed in their head, like, maybe this isn't the way to live, to be dominated by the Soviets. So you could do, anything from armed insurgency to, pranks that are kind of in the middle, all the way down to, like I say, just owning a piece of Ukrainian literature. So
yeah, and that's been something sort of throughout history, right? A lot of resistance to occupying forces or to authoritarian governments, and that comes through humor. And, little things like that, poke fun at, make them seem a little less, dangerous, scary, huge, impenetrable, right? If you can poke little holes in them, make them look ridiculous, make people see them as ridiculous, then you're taking away some of that power, right?
Exactly.
And I'm thinking that, over the course of so many years, right? You're talking, and I'm guessing right now you're talking more about the sort of under the USSR when Ukraine was occupied by Russia sort of through the 80s, right? Sort of time period.
Yeah.
And the one thing that I'm really interested in, and this is sort of with all global conflicts and situations like this, is language. Right, teaching a Ukrainian poem was seen as subversion, but even speaking the Ukrainian language, I think you mentioned that in your presentation, that the Ukrainian language itself, the Russians wanted to eradicate that. Occupying forces often want to eradicate language because that's where culture comes from, because that's where a resistance can come from. And that I find particularly interesting. Certainly the case here in Canada, right? We're trying to preserve indigenous languages that are on the verge of dying out. Throughout the world, there are so many languages that just aren't spoken anymore, that people don't know anymore.
Right. And I mean, yeah, we're trying to avoid I don't think it's a realistic possibility where the Ukrainian language gets stamped out. As one historian, I can't remember who it was, said, the shelves are already full, meaning the archival enterprises have already taken place. In the 1950s through the 1980s, it was pretty difficult to even write down factually, history that had happened, even just to remember, wow, I was alive for this. Like, you weren't really allowed to acknowledge any historical narrative outside of the approved party line. And of course, if you were found to be doing that, you would be thrown in the camps or lined up and shot. But there were a few periods, fluctuations during Soviet rule, during post-World War II Soviet rule. There was the thaw under Brezhnev, right? Things were frozen under Stalin, and then they thawed out a little bit, the cultural thaw, where a little bit of Western media was allowed to get in, and okay, we can have a little bit of capitalism, we can have a little bit of Western influence, and it was like, oh, maybe we should let people express themselves, like at least just privately, like maybe we shouldn't oppress that, and that turned out to be basically the undoing of the Soviet Union, because as soon as Soviet citizens got a taste of like Western life and they realized that it was better, it was pretty much downhill for the Soviet Union from there until the 1980s, where it really fell apart. Everybody pretty much knew that they had no enforcement capabilities, or at least nothing near the enforcement capabilities that they used to have. They were dismantling the Gulag system, so what was the punishment even going to be? Media was getting to be more available, like copying methods were starting to be a thing. Like in the 60s, you would maybe type out a few versions, even by hand, type out a few versions of the same document for you and your buddies, and you would circulate, samizdat is the Russian word at least, to have an understanding in your community, right? Your hyper-local community. You would have that understanding of what's going on. By the 1980s, people were just freely like Xeroxing, newspapers, zines, essentially,
Right.
that were pretty honest about the brutality and also the incompetence of Soviet rule.
And now there's the internet, which presents a whole different one level of capabilities in terms of copying and communicating and getting a message out there, but also a whole new area for a crackdown, I guess you could say. Certainly for Russia, the people who live in Russia now, I don't think see the same media that we see here.
No, no, they do not.
And I'm thinking right now, right, you've got this years long war that is a global. Does it frustrate you as a Ukrainian, or rather someone whose family came from an occupied Ukraine, to see the world not really doing as much as maybe they could to prevent what's happening right now?
Yes and no, right? On some levels, I have been so heartened by the global response. I think the majority, and I could be wrong on this, but my sense is that the majority of everyday regular people around the world have some sense of, you can't just let Russia have what they want. And there's all sorts of examples through history that illustrate that. And that's really something that's burned into Ukrainian memory. It's like we've been down this road before of like, okay, well, if you promise to be peaceful, we'll get rid of all our nuclear weapons. And that didn't work out. So we're kind of like, fool me once, but fool me twice. So yeah, I mean, we can talk a little bit more about the last 100 years of Ukrainian history and specifically of Russian attempts at Russian dominance. Russia will have, they have had, you might call, successful occupations of Ukraine in the past, but where they've been able to hold a little bit of power for a little bit of time. But the culture and the cultural continuity of Ukrainians has served, it seems to me, as infrastructure, right? Real meaningful, like actual logistical infrastructure where Ukrainians are able to, in their hyperlocal communities, still, build aid networks and build information networks and remain resilient, not just for the last 3 years or since 2014, but for the last 100 years.
Well, and resilience, you said that's, the central focus of your work. The United Nations this year, Psychology Day at the United Nations, was focused on global resilience. And the manifesto that went into that was, we are going to look at resilience from a global perspective, right? In this particular example, it would be, why would Ukrainians be asked to be resilient in the face of this Russian aggression, when instead we could build a world that is globally resilient to the actions that have led to this happening in Ukraine now, right? Like that there's a more preventative method of enhancing resilience, right? And I think some of your work says that people are more resilient than we think they are in a war zone, in a conflict zone, under these extreme conditions, that in fact maybe the global resilience pathway is the way to go from here on out.
Right. Yeah, that's a pretty astute criticism or observation of, why should a war-torn population, why should they have to be war-torn in the first place and then have to be resilient through that? Like, can't we get along at least to the point where we're not, subjugating people in this way? And, the answer is something like, I guess not, right? War is probably something that's always going to be there. If we talk about personality traits, the figure for psychopathy in the general population is somewhere between 1 or 2 8% and maybe like 5%. And so like up to 5% of people, depending on how you sort of measure it and cut it off, up to 5% of regular people are let's say, just to paint with a broad brush here, are like narcissistic, sadistic psychopaths, right? And some percentage of those people are going to end up in power, and some percentage of those people are going to go ahead with their narcissistic, sadistic, psychopathic plans for domination. And when they do, it seems to me we have to have something. Some form of resilience that isn't just preventative. And so I would love a world where we can do preventative resilience and, hold Russia accountable for their war crimes, or the USSR or the Russian Empire. Like this is an old story,
right,
where, they kind of keep doing the same thing.
Yeah, and it strikes me that it takes the rest of the world a little while to catch up when there's a global actor that's doing things like this. The Cold War, okay, Russia is the enemy and we don't like the way they do things, and we're going to, the U.S. goes into Afghanistan as a proxy to fight Russia, right? Things like that happen. And then the wall comes down, and like you said, Brezhnev and the thawing out period, and it looks like, okay, then it's like the rest of the world has let their guard down, and then they get surprised when it happens again, and that kind of thing, right?
Right. Yeah, I think if anything frustrates me, it's that sense of surprise. Like what do you mean you're surprised? Like this is what happens every time you make a concession with Russia. That's in the playbook. It's not an accident. It's not because they keep having, antisocial personalities. I mean, maybe it's that too, but like, look, it's part of the playbook, right? It's part of the playbook of empire and of colonization, if we want to invoke something like that.
Yeah, that's true. It's not just a Russian playbook. It's happened for centuries, from tons and tons of different global powers over the years, right? Your work specifically, you did this presentation and you talked about, moral injury and the way that people respond. I'm hoping you can give me just sort of, and our listeners, an overview of that. What did you seek to find and what did you find?
Right. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the work that I do. So what got me, we talked a little bit about what got me interested in resilience. And so when the full-scale invasion happened in 2022, I was first and foremost motivated to help the war effort in some kind of meaningful way from my faraway position in Canada. The war is very close for my family. I have uncles and cousins, one cousin who's no longer with us, sadly, who have made great sacrifices in the war, and I think first and foremost, I was not willing to sit idly by while that happened. So what I sought to find out was how can we identify protective factors in social relationships, right? In personality, in temperament. How can we identify factors to encourage resilience? So one of the things that emerged when we were looking at these survivor narratives, and backing up for a second, the goal of looking at historical survivor narratives, first from Gulag camps, that was the sample that my uncles were in, and my senior undergrad thesis, honors thesis, was looking at Holodomor survivors. And so the point of looking at different survivor populations, historical survivor populations in Ukraine, was, okay, look, this keeps happening. And so what about the last few times it's happened? What did they do then? Are there relationships between psychological variables that support resilience, and then in turn we can support those psychological factors in order to support resilience, depending on the context of the trauma and things like that? Because we saw some resilience factors generalize across the Gulag and the Holodomor, which are very different traumas. The Holodomor being an engineered famine from 1932 to 33 under Stalin that was meant to starve out Ukrainians, and the Gulag system of camps being, these work camps that were used as punishment for anybody who got on the wrong side of the Soviet leadership. And so there's similar traumas in that they are systemic sort of state violence, but also very different because, of course, being starved is quite different than being put in a camp. And so what we found was some psychological factors supporting resilience, generalizing across these two populations, and some that didn't. The most prominent one that did generalize being achievement motive, the motivation to strive for a goal, even under duress, was robustly related to the well-being facet of resilience. The way we measured resilience was low stress, high well-being, and so there's stress reduction and there's increasing well-being. This achievement motive variable was always related to well-being.
Can you give me maybe an example of the achievement motive? One of the survivors in the narratives that you read, what was maybe one of the achievement motives that, just to give some context?
Sure. I think the best example I can give, the most unilateral example, is achieving a free and independent Ukraine. That was really the goal of most of these dissidents. In the Gulag survivor population, that was the goal. In the Holodomor survivors, these were people who just wanted to survive. And so you do see some differences there in the psychological factors, yeah.
And that's a really big achievement motive, right? I was thinking that you were going to say something like, just by the end of next week, I'm going to, be able to, publish this, essay that I otherwise wouldn't, or something, right? But a free Ukraine is a massive motive. It's not something one person can take on their own. So is the community sense of that achievement motive, that others are in this with me and we're all aiming for this goal, part of that, do you think?
So I expected that it would be. That wasn't actually what our data showed. There was no relationship between, it's called affiliation motive. That's, like you mentioned, forming relationships, forming social bonds. You would think that social support might reinforce resilience, but we just didn't find that in the studies that we ran. Of course, these people were socially supported. The people in Gulag camps, in some cases, they were. I don't want to use the word thrilled to be there, but in a sense, what showed up in a lot of these narratives was dissidents in the 1960s who were inspired by dissidents from the 1940s getting put in prison with their heroes.
Right. Almost a badge of honor. I did something that was worthy of this.
Right. And so they're like, reading somebody's poetry or reading literally, the handbook on Ukrainian dissidents that some guy or another might have written. And then they end up in prison with the guy who wrote that, and they get to ask him questions and actually develop their own sense of leading that journey toward liberation and toward independence. And so, so there was a variety of experiences in Gulag, even though it's this negative, intensely negative thing, right? A lot of people actually did gain, it seems, qualitatively through the narratives. Like I say, the quantitative data did not show a relationship, but it does seem that particularly in the Gulag, a lot of people, these survivors did gain resilience from the social support that they had in the camps, particularly that ideological social support of being surrounded by like-minded individuals who all got put in there for similar reasons.
Right. And so if that's one of the main factors that predicts resilience, is this motivational factor, how do you foster that in people in order to predictively make them resilient down the line?
So that's a massive question that a lot of people, a lot of psychologists do try to tackle, right? How do we instill motivation? Like, period, right? Like, just that as a broad question. That's a huge area of psych. In survivors, where you're not trying to instill some motive to get some outcome, but instead you're maybe wanting to look at motivations that can be protective, and how do you encourage people to be motivated so that they can remain resilient. Culture. I think culture is the main infrastructure for that. That's going to vary in different circumstances, but with the Ukrainian case, that was the other actually most robust finding next to achievement motive, was cultural identity being related to the low stress facet of resilience. That popped up in both the Gulag survivors and Holodomor survivors, where cultural identity was linked heavily to the low stress facet of resilience.
Now, that's something that I was thinking about right from the beginning when we started talking, right? You're saying that you grew up with stories of war. Your family had been in it. You still had family back there who were still in it. A century plus of war in that area. Then the culture sort of forms around that. And the resilience that I'm picturing is one based on the realities of decades upon decades and then centuries of this living in this place where this is happening. And I'm wondering if, and obviously you didn't do this specific research, but I'm just wondering if we were to do that same kind of research on a population of Canadians who have not been through this, who haven't lived this life for decades, centuries, for even a couple of minutes they haven't. Would we find the same things? I'm going to guess not, but I obviously the study would need to be done, right?
Yeah, right. I think you're right. Probably not. I don't think, the great continuity of Canadian culture exactly inspires in as many Canadians the same steadfastness that the continuity of Ukrainian culture does for Ukrainians. In Indigenous populations in Canada, there are findings that are out there that show this similar effect, that connection to their culture protects against the effects of colonization. So that's a really interesting finding that keeps showing up in these similar situations.
What's really unfortunate is that there are so many similar situations around the world, and that war really is a constant and that it's always happening somewhere on the planet. My thanks to Tomas Vanderkam for joining me on today's episode of Mindful. To you at home for listening, streaming, downloading, and reviewing today's episode. Tomas has uploaded a video of his presentation from the Canadian Psychological Association's convention to YouTube. You can watch it at the link in the show notes. As always, Mindful is hosted, written, and published by me, Eric Bowman. Our editor and producer is Jamie Montgomery, and our theme music is Avenues by David Taylor.